Hi there, Anna. How's it going?
Hey, Shay. Not gonna lie, I'm feeling down about, there's the war in Ukraine, which is
Mm,
turning out to be more and more of a genocide,
hmm
impending famine in Sri Lanka, a slew of demoralizing far right leaning elections going on in the
Hmm.
world,
hmm
political turmoil in Pakistan, and then just ridiculous amounts of shootings across the US as usual.
Oh, and there's still a pandemic raging on.
Right, the pandemic.
Yeah, it can all be very overwhelming. There's
Mm.
so much to consider. There's always something new to process, to try to wrap your head around, it seems. And I mean, by the time this episode comes out, the war in Ukraine will have been waging on for almost 2 months, and
Yeah.
I still feel helpless.
And I think a lot of people share that sentiment.
Mm,
Whenever a crisis of some kind happens in the world, people take to their networks, right? Trying to be
mm,
helpful in their own way.
yeah.
Beyond the general discourse in the media, teachers, I've noticed on teacher Twitter, when something happens in the world, there's just this flurry of resources for how to talk about that specific event with students.
Yeah. Teachers tend to take on this role of being responsible for addressing what's going on in the world, right?
Hmm.
And overall, I think that's positive. Teachers need the tools to be able to address current events, especially when there is a crisis. And sharing those tools for addressing specific crises, that's great. But in addition to that, having these conversations would be much easier if discussions of current events were a more regular routine in the classroom.
So let's explore that. Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think-Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Anna.
And I'm Shay. And today we're going to look at how current events are addressed in our learning context. To what extent are we responsible for bringing in these topics to unpack with our students? What are the advantages and the challenges in doing so? And what strategies can we consider?
Yeah, so this is a topic that we've talked about at many different points in time over the last few years.
Mm.
And we've both grappled with the logistical and just human emotional elements of discussing current events in the English language classroom context.
Before we really dive in, I want to address the elephant in the room, Anna. It's quite possible that not all of our listeners believe that it's their job to discuss current events in the language classroom.
Yeah, that's a great point. Language educators might think it's not their role, that it's the role of parents or guardians, or even the students themselves in the case of adults, to ensure that they know what's happening in the world around them. Or maybe they think these topics would be more appropriately addressed in content-specific courses where teachers can more naturally unpack these events than in a language classroom.
Right. But I tend to disagree, and I think you do too,
Uh-huh.
with the notion that language educators shouldn't have any part in this process. In fact, I think that we can play a huge role here in preparing students to have conversations about the tough stuff.
Absolutely. So for us, really, this conversation isn't about whether or not these topics should make it into the classroom, but rather a question of to what extent and how from a practical standpoint.
And I think that those questions can only be answered through examining context.
So I want to be transparent here and say that I haven't always addressed current events in the classroom. And the reason that I have more recently is that I've been teaching courses that are more related to critical thinking and media literacy. In 2020, I was working with a group of Armenian students as a part of my virtual fellowship through the U.S. Department of State, and I actually had a course that was called Critical Thinking and the Media that I got to design from scratch. It was fun. And so I had all these opportunities to talk about current events because that was what we were doing. That was one of the primary goals for the course. Essentially, I was taking the context of the time and basically asking students to apply critical thinking skills to analyze what was happening in the media. And it just so happened to also be a very emotionally charged time for the students. It was during that semester that Nagorno-Karabakh, and I'm not going to go into the whole history of this right now because it's very complicated, but Azerbaijan and Armenia in a nutshell have had this ongoing dispute or war. And listen, these are charged words and each side uses them differently, and I'm definitely coming off as biased in some way, no matter how I phrase this. But in the fall of 2020, it escalated when Azerbaijan's military launched an attack on the region, which is historically mostly ethnically Armenian, but has been politically recognized as part of Azerbaijan since the fall of the Soviet Union. And so, the important thing here is my students had a lot at stake in this war. They had family members on the front line. So I had a lot of emotions going through my classroom at the time, and it got me thinking about the question of how to address sensitive events in my practice.
Wow. I mean, within that particular context, I think it would have been inappropriate and perhaps even insensitive not to acknowledge what was happening in that moment. There are some instances where it seems inevitable, right?
Right.
In an ESOL context where you potentially have students from all over the world, choosing what's relevant and how to approach it isn't super straightforward, right? Like with the conflict you've brought up, I didn't have any students from Armenia or Azerbaijan or even that region of the world, so that was not something that I talked about extensively in my class. Since my students hailed from so many different countries, I think I had like 12 students and 8 or 9 different home countries represented in that class.
Oh, yeah.
Making that specific event relevant for them would mean doing a ton of research into connections between the events taking place in Nagorno-Karabakh and their own country's histories. For my students, there was a layer of removal, right? And also for me.
And that's understandable.
I want to add that my reticence also had to do with my ignorance, given the complexity of the issue, the historical nuances, everything that you mentioned there. It wasn't something that I personally felt comfortable going into with my students. With just a rudimentary understanding, I couldn't do the topic justice. I couldn't convey the significance in a way that I wanted to. I was ultimately an uninformed cultural outsider.
I mean, even I felt like a cultural outsider in that scenario since I'm not Armenian. And although I had spent some months there for my fellowship before the pandemic forced me back to the States, I didn't feel like I had the authority to opine that much or at all, really. In that situation, all I could really do was offer emotional support. I had students not showing up, suddenly dropping off because they were feeling emotional, calling into class from volunteer sites where they were gathering supplies for families and the military. It was just so present in their lives. I couldn't avoid acknowledging it, but at the same time, I didn't want to go in there and present myself as Miss Objectivity. Me trying to say, hey, there are two sides to this would have been insensitive to the collective trauma they were going through.
Yes.
So really, what I wanted to create was a safe space where they could breathe, center themselves, and approach this topic of critical thinking and the news in a constructive way. So we ended up talking about parallel topics instead, like the protests in Belarus at the time. That was safer yet more familiar territory for them than, say, something that was happening in the US at that moment.
Yeah, I think a lot of people's automatic response in that situation might be to be objective. But for your students, objectivity might look like bias or lack of support for their cause. So it's important to discuss relevant current events, but also consider the emotions taking place in the way that you end up discussing them. When something traumatic happens, you couldn't just go into the classroom and be like, oh, hey, how are you doing today? Right? You already know the answer to that question. So instead, maybe you would say things like, thank you for coming today. I know that this is a difficult time for you. I want you to take a moment here to just breathe and think about something different, if that's possible for you.
Yeah, I tried to create a respite from it somehow. And I mean, who knows if that really was the best approach. But anyway, addressing trauma in the classroom is a layer of discussing current events in the classroom. We need to recognize that a lot of times current events affect our students.
Absolutely. And not even just the trauma of a major crisis for a specific country, like involving bloodshed and displacement of peoples and horrific things like that. The pandemic was also traumatic, is traumatic. The cumulative trauma of the pandemic, that could definitely be categorized as a shared traumatic experience.
Oh, yeah, there were, and honestly still are, a lot of emotions going on.
Yeah. I was working with university freshmen throughout the transition to online learning. And during their first and second semesters, they were told, you can't come to campus anymore. You have to sit in your tiny dorm and work online. And naturally, many of them were feeling bitter about that because they felt that their college experience was being robbed from them. Not to mention the prolonged isolation, the Zoom fatigue, right? Students who were supposed to be studying abroad were suddenly stuck with my floating head on Zoom. So it's, there's a lot lost there. And when we're talking about international students, they're missing the comfort of their home during a really difficult moment. So there was definitely a lot of negativity associated with that transition, even for the students who didn't suffer in the most obvious way, right? Like with the loss of a loved one.
Yeah, we all had trouble coping, especially in the first months of lockdown. So as educators, we're tasked with creating a space for sharing when students want to share, but also make it possible for a bit of detachment, of focused distraction really in that same space.
Right. Sometimes we talked about how terrible the situation was. Other times we tried to find the silver lining. We even avoided conversation about the pandemic at all costs on some days. What I found was that students really had different strategies for moving through that moment and thus different needs, right? Some of them really wanted to talk about it. They wanted to share that they were feeling isolated, that they were feeling depressed, that they, had regrets about even moving to the States. But then there were some that were like, well, it is what it is, and we're lucky that we can still attend class.
I think that might explain why so many teachers are reticent to bring up current events. They're usually pretty difficult to process. There's usually some pain involved, and ultimately, we're not psychologists.
Right. We're not necessarily trained to support our students optimally in those scenarios.
That's true. So if the idea of talking about current events in your class makes you squeamish because there's potential that it could get heavy, we encourage you to think of the potential benefit of this for your students in the right context. They're going to need to talk about difficult things outside of your classroom, so focus on how incredible a support you can be in getting them equipped for that.
There can be just immense value in examining current events, if done correctly, with the goal of simply becoming more aware global citizens.
Keyword.
Yeah. I've often thought about whether current events should be only examined when we think it affects our students directly. But there are two things wrong with this. First, heightened awareness of the world around us, even when we think an event doesn't apply to our day-to-day, has more advantages, at least in my opinion, than disadvantages. We are cultivating empathy and getting students to think beyond their microcosms, right? And secondly, who are we to decide what might affect our students? We only know what they share with us. And I think it's presumptuous to think that we have a comprehensive understanding of what matters to them.
Yeah, when it comes to addressing current events in the classroom, I think it's important to provide the space for our English learners to talk about current events. But it's very, very easy to impose what we think is important, what we think they need to do to feel better. And so I think probably in terms of choosing what to talk about, I think it needs to come from the students. I think that this is really coming back to this idea of student-centeredness that we always emphasize.
Yeah, I mean, it needs to be a conversation. Maybe you create a space for current events where they can pipe up and talk about a current event that has been troubling them or that they really want to process in the classroom. And in that way, we're not just dictating what news we think is worth mentioning. We have to take care not to be so US-centric and not lose touch of what might be more important to our population of learners. That's also an example of bias, which you brought up earlier as something that we can anticipate when discussing the news.
Yeah, bias is always present, right? But especially when you're talking about current events. So as educators, bringing current events into the classroom, there are so many forms of bias that we need to consider. First, when it comes to talking about the news, we need to leave our bias at the door. We can bring up topics, but we need to keep our personal opinions out of it. It's just so hard because we're human beings and we're subjective. But if we're going to talk about current events, we need to take care not to impose our beliefs.
Totally. But we also have to recognize that even in selecting events to bring up, we're talking about a form of bias, right? It's really tricky, and that's why I think having the students select what's important to them is really key, because first of all, it allows us to remove ourselves from the equation and not impose what we think is important, allowing them to show us that instead. And I also think that we'll get a wider range of issues within the classroom that maybe we wouldn't coming from our white US-centric lens.
You know what else is US centric though?
Mm.
Our emphasis on sharing. Even having these discussions is also very specific to our own belief system.
Yes.
I've worked with students from countries where it's just not considered appropriate to have potentially controversial discussions in a public forum.
And I think in many countries, this idea of being critical about anything that's shared by the government or the media,
which are sometimes one and the same.
Yeah, right. Being critical, especially in a semi-public forum, is something that's just not done.
Yeah, and so recognizing that we have this privilege as people who live in the United States to speak our minds freely, because that's not the reality everywhere. This is important. There's going to be a learning curve, especially when students come from places where the government controls the media, where there might be propaganda and or censorship involved.
So yet again, we come full circle to this idea of creating a safe environment where they feel that they can open up. How can we allow our learners to feel like they can share in a way that maybe they haven't before?
Yeah. So it does take a lot of training, a lot of buildup, this process where you slowly open them up to this idea of questioning their realities, questioning the news, and having a reaction to the news that is not dictated by what the news says.
And once we get them to a point of comfortable sharing, then we can start to ask students to notice their own biases and the biases that exist in everything that they consume.
We have to do an episode just on media literacy, don't we?
We do. We certainly do.
But giving the students the tools they need to decode media is especially critical in discussion around current events.
Yeah. So a few years back, I taught a course called Journalism and Media Studies. And we did a lot of work decoding messaging in the news. The culminating project for this course was to create an e-newspaper. So throughout the semester, we focused a lot on critical inquiry and examining their sources, author's purpose, audience, tone, charged vocabulary, etc. And to get them into the journalist mindset, if you will, they had to come to class each week with a piece of news to share. I would usually put them in concentric circles, also known as inside-outside circle, and have them share the main ideas, give them a chance to share their opinions, ask questions, and report back about their findings.
You've told me about this course before, and you presented on the e-newspaper project at TESOL, right?
That's the one.
Great project. Love it.
Great course.
And what I appreciate about that concentric circles routine is that it served so many purposes, right? You're building comprehension skills, encouraging them to ask questions for clarification and detail. They're using reporting verbs, but you're also putting them in a situation where they have to respond to news that may or may not apply to them. And you're also asking them to listen to their peers' opinions, which may very well differ from their own.
It's great for so many things. But one of my primary goals was to simply get them comfortable with this process of sharing and engaging with varied perspectives.
That's so important. I imagine there were some challenging moments of disagreement, but there's so much opportunity in those sort of visceral reactions. Like, fine, you feel disgusted by the news, a statement from a particular politician, or even by something that one of your peers shared. But why is that your reaction? What part of your lived experience is informing that reaction?
Exactly. How are their individual and cultural lenses impacting their perception of what's happening, of the conversations that they're having?
It's so important to have students think not just of bias in the news, but their own personal bias.
But I think biases in general can feel a bit abstract, and even more so when you're working with more beginner students.
But you can talk about feelings, right? And then you can ask, why do you feel that way? And they can express it even at a beginner level in just a way that they can express it. And you can ask those WH questions. Who did this? Why is this happening? What is this? Why does this person say this about this? Just keeping it in very simple language.
Absolutely. This is something that needs to be facilitated somehow, no matter the level, I think, because media literacy just applies to every kind of media. Media is the text message that students receive. It's bumper sticker slogans. It's on the t-shirts we buy. So there is just incredible opportunity of transference here. It's not just about unpacking current events.
Right. So, Shay, we've talked about contextual considerations like the possibility of trauma, how students' experiences discussing current events will impact their ability to do so with ease. We've touched on bias, ours, theirs, and that of the media, but we sort of danced around the reality that some students don't have the language necessary to have these conversations.
Yeah, there's a linguistic element there. It's all about scaffolding, though, isn't it?
Always.
Always. It's always the answer. Differentiation and scaffolding. So at lower proficiency levels, maybe your students need sentence stems to get rolling or graphic organizers to support them in their reading and processing. Maybe students at the intermediate level need checklists that aid them in deciphering tone and charged language. And I tend to think that current events can't be a separate section of your class, something that you do just once a month, right? It's helpful when you can create meaningful connections between the content they're examining and the language they're acquiring.
Totally agree. Actually, one of our listeners, Amir in Iran, shared how he often uses a piece of news as a resource for teaching grammar points, vocabulary, and reading strategies. Since he teaches in a flipped learning environment, students first interact with the reading with guiding questions, and then he gets into specific elements of the assigned reading during a synchronous session where he goes deeper into a grammar point or key vocabulary. At the end of the session, they'll have a discussion about the topic where they have to use whatever piece of language they just examined together.
Awesome, Amir. Thanks so much for sharing. I'm sure that your students get so much out of your approach. And Anna, Amir's work also highlights the fact that integrating the news into your class doesn't always have to be formal or stuffy. It doesn't have to inspire dread, right? It can be seamless.
Right, that's a great point. We don't always have to talk about the news with an article or an assignment in mind. It can just be, I think, an open forum in the class. Like something happened over the weekend that was super crazy and is consuming everybody, and they just need a place to voice their reactions. They need that public square to talk with other people and do so without judgment, no matter how little they might understand about the event. You can have them piece together what they know as a group and then sort of ask questions about what they already know, collectively filling in each other's gaps.
I love that you're emphasizing that it's okay to not know all of the details or even how to react to what's happening. They can help each other understand and process everything. I think approaching the news in this way, this sort of collective meaning making, helps take the pressure off of students to understand everything that's going on in the world all of the time. It can be really beneficial, and in moments of crisis, I think it's healthy for them and for you, as long as you're not forcing them into that conversation, right? You don't want to trigger, you don't want to make them do something that they don't feel comfortable doing. So make them comfortable first, and then get into it.
And while you're at it, maybe consider how you can bring in good news too.
Yes.
Our Western news doesn't do a very good job at highlighting when good things are happening. So maybe even integrate something like, I don't know, a good news section of a class, 5 minutes for what's something great that happened within your community or in your country or globally.
That's so important. What's the good word? I think that when people think about news in general, the first reaction is just to kind of shut down because the news can be burdensome. It's depressing. So how can we lighten it a little bit while still acknowledging that we, the human race, have a lot of work to do?
There's that global citizenship education sneaking its way into the conversation.
I can't resist, though, because ultimately that's what we're trying to do, to create more global-minded thinkers, right? In speaking critically about events, we're perspective taking and amplifying, we're building empathy.
You're leading by example when you talk about what's happening outside of the classroom, but you're teaching them to lead when you open the floor to them too. You're making them better humans.
Yeah. And we're not exaggerating the importance of our work here, people.
No, teachers do have an impact. So listeners, we love to hear from you. How are you bringing current events into your classroom? If you're not, what's your hesitation? Let's figure this out together.
You can join the conversation on our various social media accounts. Email us via our contact form at teacherthinkaloud.com or comment via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. We welcome your reflections, questions, and ideas.
For more resources related to today's topic, take a look at our website and our podcast anchor page, anchor.fm/teacherthinkaloud. To help us continue exploring these important topics, consider donating at teacherthinkaloud.com/support-us.
And while we could use the funds, supporting us doesn't mean you need to spend your hard-earned cash. If you've appreciated anything you heard today, please consider sharing this episode with a colleague and help expand our reach.
That makes a huge difference too.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. And until next time, happy teaching
and happy reflecting.